The wind had a way of whistling through the empty streets of the old village, carrying with it the sound of creaking boards, rattling shutters, and the faint smell of smoke from dying fires. It was late in the season, one of those bitter nights, when winter seemed to bite harder than ever, and the prairie lay frozen under a pale moon. Folks who lived here knew better than to wander after sundown. The wolves stayed close to the tree line. The cold made the air sharp as glass, and the silence reminded every soul how far they were from the comfort of the cities back east. This was the edge of the land where a man or woman could vanish without leaving more than a boot track in the snow dot in the distance. The outline of a horse and rider appeared, moving slow, like both were worn past their limits. The figure slumped. Low in the saddle, a shadow of a man who had seen too many miles. His coat was torn at the shoulder, the brim of his hat bent, and the animal beneath him stumbled every few steps. He looked like a cowboy out of place and out of time, far from any cattle drive, carrying more weight in his silence than in his saddlebag. The frost clung to his beard, his hands stiff on the reins. He was searching for something, maybe shelter, maybe forgiveness, maybe just a place where the night wouldn't claim him. The village ahead wasn't much to speak of. A saloon with lanterns glowing faintly, a small trading post, a blacksmith's shed, and a few scattered cabins. Once, maybe, it had been a hopeful place, the kind settlers carved out of wilderness with rough tools and stubborn hearts. Now it looked more like a ghost town. The windows were dark, the doors barred, and smoke rose only from one chimney. He pulled his horse closer, the snow crunching beneath the hooves, and his breath rising in clouds. He knew if he didn't find warmth soon, neither he nor his horse would see the sunrise dot just when he thought the night had swallowed every bit of life from the place. A door creaked open. From the shadow stepped a woman, tall and steady, with eyes that caught the moonlight like river water. Her dark hair was braided against the cold, and the blanket around her shoulders looked hand-woven, the kind only made with patience and care. Her gaze lingered on the cowboy for a long moment, and then her voice cut through the silence with a firmness that left no room for question. "Cowboy, we are shivering. Get in my shelter now," said the Apache woman without hesitation. The word startled him more than the sudden swing of a gun or the snap of a wolf's jaw. Her tone carried no fear, only command and a strange kind of concern. He didn't know her, but something about the way she stood there calm, unflinching, made him want to trust her. Still, he hesitated. Men like him didn't wander into strangers' homes without a second thought. Not in these parts, not with history carved deep into the land between settler and native. Yet the cold pressed harder, his body weak from the long ride, and his horse let out a sound that was more plea than breath. The woman stepped aside, motioning with her hand. Inside, the firelight flickered against the walls of her cabin. Warmth spilled into the night air, calling him in like a promise. He slid down from the saddle, his legs nearly giving way under him. The woman moved toward the horse first, her hand brushing its muzzle, whispering words in her language. The animal stilled, its trembling eased by her voice. Then she looked at him again, as though testing whether he had the strength or the will to step forward. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar smoke and herbs drying on the rafters. A clay pot simmered on the hearth, filling the room with the scent of corn and wild roots. She pointed to a chair near the fire, her expression unreadable. He sank into it, stretching his hands toward the flames, the sting of warmth almost painful. After the chill outside, for a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the shutters, and the night carried on as if nothing unusual had happened. But both of them knew this was no ordinary meeting. Cowboys didn't stumble into Apache homes without reason, and Apache women didn't open their doors to strangers unless something greater stirred beneath the surface. At last, he cleared his throat. His voice was rough, nearly broken from disuse. "I didn't mean to intrude." Her eyes softened, just slightly, but her reply held steady. "If I wanted you gone, you'd still be out there." He nodded, taking in the weight of her words. She wasn't just saving a man from the cold she had chosen, against all the warnings of her people and the memories of old wars, to trust him with her fire, her food, her space. That meant something. He knew enough about survival to recognize when life handed him a rare kind of mercy. Still, there was a reason he had been riding through that frozen night, a reason his coat was torn and his spirit heavier than his saddle. He carried it like a burden across his shoulders, and he could feel her noticing it even without words. The way her gaze lingered told him she saw more than his shivering hands or tired horse. She saw a man carrying trouble. The hours dragged. As the storm outside deepened, rattling against the cabin walls, she moved about quietly, adding wood to the fire, checking on the pot, every movement careful and deliberate. He watched her, not out of suspicion, but because in this moment she was the only anchor keeping him from drifting into the cold forever. Finally, when he thought his eyes would close from sheer exhaustion, she spoke again. "The land doesn't. Forgive easy. Whatever brought you here, be sure you're ready to carry it." Her words cut through him sharper than any blade. He looked up, meeting her gaze. There was no accusation in her tone, but something else, warning maybe, or understanding. He wanted to ask how much she knew, whether she had seen the riders that had been on his trail, or if she had heard the distant echo of shots fired the night before. But before he could speak, the sound came again, distant, faint, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. They rolled across the frozen ground, carried by the wind, growing closer. The cowboy's chest tightened. He knew that rhythm too well. The woman stiffened too, her head tilting as she listened. Neither of them moved for a heartbeat, the fire's glow flickering across their faces. Then she whispered, low and certain, "They're coming." The cowboy's hand instinctively went to his side, where his revolver rested heavy against his hip. The woman stood tall, her blanket falling from her shoulders, her eyes steady as the night outside. For a moment, the firelight caught the glint of something sharp she kept hidden near the doorway. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer, until it seemed the whole village shook with their thunder. The cowboy rose to his feet, his body aching, but his spirit alert once more. He didn't know if these riders came to finish what had begun, or if fate had other plans. All he knew was that the night wasn't over, and neither was the danger. The woman looked at him, her voice calm but urgent. "Decide. Quick, stand with me or leave now." The fire roared, the hoofbeats thundered, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath. And in that narrow cabin, two strangers waited for the storm that was about to break upon them. The sound of the hoofbeats grew sharper, clearer, as if the riders were carving their way straight through the night. The cowboy felt the pulse in. His throat quickened, each beat matching the rhythm outside. His fingers hovered close to his revolver, though he didn't draw it yet. He had lived long enough to know that pulling steel too early only painted a bigger target. The Apache woman's eyes never left the door. Her stance was firm, rooted like the ancient cottonwoods by the river, steady even as the storm rattled the cabin walls. The riders did not pass by. They slowed. The scrape of hooves against ice and snow lingered, circling the edge of the village. A man's voice called out faintly, muffled by the wind, but close enough to stir the cowboy's memory. He had heard it before, maybe only a day or two ago. The voice carried the grit of whiskey, the sharpness of a man who gave orders without kindness. His breath caught. They had followed him here. The woman turned to him at last, her gaze sharp as flint. "You bring trouble." He didn't deny it. There was no use in lying when the truth already pressed against the cabin door. He let out a slow breath, his voice heavy. "They're hunting me. Not the law, not bounty men worse. Her brow furrowed slightly, though. She said nothing. Instead, she moved toward the hearth, stirring the pot with quiet hands. The simple act made the tension more unbearable, as though she was reminding him that storms came and went, and only those who knew patience survived them. The cowboy leaned against the wall, shoulders aching from more than just the cold. His mind wandered back to the night before, to the firelight dancing on the ridge, the echo of gunshots against canyon stone. He had left men behind, men who wouldn't forgive his choice. He wasn't sure if they wanted his life or something else he carried, but either way, they would not stop until they had it. The woman spoke again, her tone almost steady, though the weight of her words cut deep. These men, they will not care who they burn to reach you. Her voice held no accusation, only truth. He looked around her cabin, the woven mats, the clay bowls, the carefully stacked wood. It was a home built with care, carved out of years of survival. And now it stood in the path of the storm he had dragged to her door. "I'll leave," he muttered, though the tremble in his body betrayed how little strength he had left. "Better they find me out there than bring ruin to you." But she shook her head, her braids swaying with emotion. "The cold will finish you before they do. You stay until I say otherwise." Her words surprised him, not because of their firmness, he had already seen that in her, but because of the strange current beneath them. She wasn't protecting him alone. She was protecting the choice she had made, and once her mind was set, the prairie winds themselves would not move her. The hoofbeats outside grew faint for a moment, then returned louder, closer, like wolves, circling a wounded deer. The cowboy's hand clenched against the worn wood of the chair. He remembered the leader's face, sharp and cruel, eyes always looking for weakness. He remembered the deal that had gone wrong, the shouts, the gunfire, the way the stars seemed to hide that night. And he remembered the small satchel still, tied to his horse, holding the very thing they wanted back. The woman's eyes flicked to him, as if reading the thoughts written on his face. "You carry something," she said softly. "Something worth blood." His silence gave her all the answer she needed. She didn't press further, but he could see the judgment flicker in her eyes, the weighing of whether her shelter had been given to a man cursed by his own choices. The storm outside thickened, snow sweeping across the windows, howling like a choir of restless spirits. The riders' voices grew distant again, though the cowboy knew they weren't gone. Men like that didn't give up. They were waiting for weakness, for dawn, for the right moment to strike. The woman sat across from him at last, her blanket drawn back over her shoulders. She studied him in silence, the firelight dancing across her face. Her eyes seemed to carry generations in them, the long memory of land and loss. At last she spoke, her words measured. "Long before you came here, this land was already heavy with bones. Men fought for it, killed for it, and still the earth swallows them whole. You are only another." Her words stung not from cruelty, but from truth. He had ridden across many places, seen graves unmarked and promises broken. He had thought himself different once, younger, when the trail still seemed like freedom. But now, sitting in this cabin with death at his heels, he wasn't so sure. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice low. "But I didn't come here to die." She didn't answer. Instead, she rose again, moving toward the door, her hand brushing against the hidden blade she kept there. She stood in silence, listening, as though the night itself whispered secrets. To her, the cowboy felt the hairs on his neck rise. The fire popped, breaking the silence for a moment. He shifted in his chair, his mind heavy with questions he dared not ask. Who was this woman who had opened her home to a stranger, knowing death might follow? Why did she stand so steady when any other soul would have barred the door and left him to freeze? He thought back to her first words spoken not as a plea, but as a command. There had been no hesitation then, no fear in her voice. It was as if she had already known he would come, as if the night itself had carried him to her door. The sound outside shifted again, the hoofbeats moving away into the storm. The cowboy's shoulders eased just slightly, though his hand never strayed far from his revolver. He knew they were not gone. He knew dawn would bring more than light. The woman turned back from the door at last, her eyes sharp. "They wait," she said simply. The cowboy nodded. "They always do." The night stretched long, each hour marked by the crack of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by the sound of riders shifting in the dark and the restless stirring of his horse outside. Each time his eyes closed, he saw flashes of the past, the faces of men he once rode with, the deals made over whiskey and cards, the gun drawn too fast. He saw the satchel again, heavy with what they wanted, heavy with guilt. By the time dawn began to creep across the horizon, pale and cold, the cowboy knew there would be no easy escape. The storm outside had softened, but the danger had not. The woman had not slept. She stood near the window, her silhouette against the first gray light, her eyes scanning the horizon. He rose stiffly, adjusting his coat, his revolver heavy at his side. The horse outside snorted, restless. The woman finally looked at him, her voice calm but unyielding. "Today," she said, "the ground will drink blood. The only question is whose." The cowboy met her gaze, his chest tightening at the weight of her words. He wanted to ask if she would stand with him, if she believed his fight was worth joining. But the words stuck in his throat. Outside, the hoofbeats returned once more, steady and sure, no longer circling but closing in. The riders had waited out the storm, and now they came with the rising sun. The cowboy's hand tightened on his weapon. The Apache woman reached for her blade. Neither spoke. The fire hissed low, the snow crunched under hooves, and the village held its breath. The day had come, and with it, the reckoning. The riders did not rush. They came slow, deliberate, as though they wanted every sound of their horses' hooves to seep into the village and settle heavy in the bones of whoever listened. The cowboy could count at least 4, maybe 5. There. Shadows stretched long in the pale morning light, wavering across the snow. From inside the cabin, the Apache woman and the cowboy stood like statues, their breath shallow, their hearts braced. The air between them thickened, as though the fire had stolen the last of the room's oxygen. One rider called out, his voice rough with authority. "We know you're here. Don't make us tear this place apart." The cowboy closed his eyes. For a brief second, he knew that voice too well. The leader. A man who never left anything unfinished, who had no use for mercy. The sound of him brought back the canyon night, the flash of gun barrels, the split-second choice that had left 2 men sprawled in the dirt and the satchel in the cowboy's hand. That satchel still rested with his horse outside, tied down, holding more than money. It held proof, secrets, maybe even a death sentence. The Apache woman watched him, her expression unreadable. He could feel her weighing him against the danger now at her door. He wished he had words to explain, to justify, but the truth was muddy and blood-stained. What mattered now was survival. The riders dismounted. The crunch of boots on snow echoed. Too close. Their voices lowered, sharp whispers carried by the wind. The woman moved toward the window, parting the edge of the curtain just enough to see. Her eyes narrowed. She counted them without words, then looked back at him with a glance. That said enough. Too many. The cowboy's mind raced. He thought of slipping out the back, drawing their attention away from the cabin. But his body ached with exhaustion, and he knew they would outlast him. He thought of making a stand inside, but the cabin walls were thin, and bullets would find them fast. The woman must have seen the storm in his thoughts. because she spoke in a voice low but steady. "You are not the first man to bring death to this village," she said, "but I will not run. If they come through that door, they will learn whose land they step upon." The words struck him harder than the cold. She wasn't offering him comfort. She was drawing a line in the dirt, ready to fight for her ground. Whether he stood with her or not, outside, the leader's voice boomed again. "You've got no place left to hide, cowboy. Hand it over, and maybe we'll leave you breathing." The cowboy's jaw tightened. The woman turned to him, her gaze piercing. "What do they want?" For a long breath, he said nothing. The fire snapped, the rider shifted outside, and the weight of her question pressed harder. At last, he admitted, his voice raw. "Not gold. Not cattle. Papers. Land deeds. Proof that would hang men like them in front of any judge willing to listen." Her eyes sharpened. "Stolen?" He shook his head quickly. "Not stolen. Taken from men who'd already stolen from others. They kill, they burn, they drive families. Off the land. I rode with them once before I knew what they were. When I turned against them, I took what I could. I thought maybe I could set it right." Her silence cut deeper than any words. He knew how hollow it sounded, another drifter claiming he carried justice in his saddlebag. Yet her gaze did not soften, nor did it harden completely. She only seemed to measure whether he was fool enough to be telling the truth. The riders had begun moving again, circling toward the horse tied near the cabin. The animal stamped nervously, sensing the danger. One man cursed, yanking at the saddle. The cowboy's chest tightened. "They'll find it." The woman didn't move from the window. Her voice carried a quiet weight. "Then they will not leave." The cowboy's hand hovered near his revolver, but she stopped him with a look. Her expression was not reckless, it was calculating. She had lived on this land longer than any outlaw. She knew its silence, its echoes, its ways of swallowing. Strangers whole. Suddenly, a shout rang out. One of the men had found the satchel. The leader barked orders, his voice sharp with triumph. The cowboy cursed under his breath. Without thinking, he moved toward the door, but the woman caught his arm. "Wait," she whispered. He froze, torn between fury and fear. The woman's grip was firm, her eyes locked on his. A storm is not stopped by running at it headfirst. Let them believe they hold the power. He swallowed hard, his body trembling with the urge to act. But her words burrowed deep. The fire cracked behind them, the morning light grew harsher, and outside, the men tore open the satchel, scattering its contents into the snow. Papers fluttered. In the wind, pages inked with signatures, seals, and names of families long driven off their land. The men laughed, stomping on them as though they were nothing more than kindling. But the leader did not laugh. He bent down, holding one paper close, his expression hardening. "Burn it all," he ordered. The cowboy's stomach twisted. All? The proof he had risked everything for all that might bring justice was about to vanish into smoke. He looked to the woman, ready to burst from the cabin, but her eyes held him still. She had not moved, not flinched. Her patience was unyielding, and then he saw why. A shadow flickered at the edge of the trees. Another figure, moving silent as the dawn. Not a rider, not one of the outlaws, someone else. The cowboy squinted, heart racing, but before he could speak, the woman gave him a slight nod, as if to say, "Wait." The riders piled the papers, striking a match against the side of a boot. The flame hissed to life. The leader watched, satisfaction etched across his face. But from the tree line, the shadow drew closer, carrying a bow carved from cedar, its arrow already nocked. The cowboy's breath caught. A second Apache. The woman's eyes gleamed in the firelight, though her face remained calm. For the first time since he'd stepped into her shelter, the cowboy understood she was not alone. And she had never intended to stand against these men without her people close by. Outside, the match burned low in the outlaw's hand. The leader leaned forward, ready to watch the proof vanish in smoke. The cowboy's pulse hammered. The second figure raised the bowstring, steady, silent, waiting for the right breath of wind out, and then the world seemed to hold still. The fire crackled low, the horses stamped nervously, and every sound carried the weight of what would come next. The cowboy gripped his revolver tighter, torn between stepping into the fight and holding back. The woman stood like stone beside him, her eyes locked on the riders. Her every breath measured. The match wavered in the outlaw's hand. The bowstring drew tighter. The cowboy's heart pounded. And the storm they had all been waiting for was about to break. The flame at the end of the match burned brighter against the pale morning, its small glow threatening to erase everything the cowboy had carried so far. The outlaw's hand shook just slightly in the cold, but his smirk told the cowboy he would not hesitate. The papers rustled in the wind like dry leaves, fragile, waiting for fire. The cowboy's every muscle screamed to move, to throw open the door, to draw steel before it was too late. But the Apache woman's hand pressed against his arm again. Steady, unshaking, her eyes telling him without words to wait. He clenched his jaw, fighting against his own instincts, listening to the drum of his heartbeat pounding louder than the wind outside. Then the bowstring sang. The arrow flew silent, through the air, cutting across the snow. It struck the outlaw's wrist before the flame touched paper. The match dropped into the drift, hissing into smoke. The man howled, clutching his arm, while the others spun toward the tree line in shock. Horses reared, snorting clouds of steam, the sudden chaos breaking the rhythm of their confidence. The leader cursed, his hand snapping to his gun. His eyes swept the line of trees, searching for the shadow that had struck. The cowboy could see the fury on his face, the same fury he had seen that night in the canyon when blood was spilled and trust was broken. He knew what came next. The leader would not rest until he ground every enemy into the dirt. The Apache woman stepped closer to the door, her fingers grazing the blade she kept hidden. Her face remained calm, but her eyes burned like embers. She whispered so low the cowboy barely heard it. "The land fights with us." Outside, the riders scattered, their boots crunching hard against the frozen ground as they fumbled for cover. Shots rang out sharp and fast, echoing across the empty village. The cowboy ducked low, his hand gripping his revolver now without hesitation. The fire inside the cabin sputtered as the air shook with thunder. Through the crack of the window, he saw the second Apache darting between trees, moving like smoke, loosing another arrow before vanishing again. One rider dropped to his knees, the snow blooming dark beneath him. The horses screamed, tied reins yanking taut against the posts. The leader shouted, his voice rough and ragged, "Find them! Burn this place down if you have to." The words cut through the cowboy like a blade. Burn this place. Burn her home. The firelight on the hearth felt suddenly fragile, as if one spark outside could erase it all. He looked at the woman beside him, and for the first time, he saw the weight of her choice, the risk she had taken letting him through her door, the danger she had accepted without hesitation. The sound of boots drew nearer. Two men rushed the side of the cabin, their shadows moving against the frosted window. The cowboy's pulse quickened. He raised his revolver, his hand steady now, his mind clear. He knew the moment had come when hesitation would mean death. Woman nodded once, her blade ready. She moved like someone who had faced storms before, her body set with a quiet strength. Together they waited, listening as the footsteps stopped just outside. The door shook under the first hard kick. Wood splintered, the frame groaning. The cowboy braced himself, the woman's eyes locked on the crack forming in the wood. Another kick. The door shuddered, the latch barely holding. Then the world narrowed to sound, the wind howling through broken shutters. The frantic cry of horses, the pounding of boots, the sharp crack of gunfire, and the steady hiss of his own breath. Time slowed, the air heavy, every second stretching thin as glass. Another blow against the door. The frame split. The latch tore free. The cowboy's revolver lifted, his finger tightening on the trigger. The door flew open, cold air bursting. Inside, two men charged through, faces twisted with fury, guns drawn. The firelight flared across steel and shadows. The woman lunged, her blade flashing, the cowboy's revolver roaring in his hand. The cabin filled with smoke, shouts, the clash of steel, the crack of gunfire. Outside, the leader bellowed orders, his voice unshaken, his rage fanning hotter than the storm. More footsteps pounded closer, more shadows gathering. The battle had begun, and the village itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of it. The cowboy's heart hammered as the fight surged around him. He knew this was no longer just about him or the papers scattered in the snow. This was about the firelight that had saved him, the woman who had given him shelter, the land that refused to bow. And in that moment, with the cabin shaking and the storm of men pressing in, he realized the reckoning he had carried all this way was no longer his alone. The climax loomed just beyond reach, heavy in the air as the fire burned low and the shadows of death pressed tighter against the walls. Gun! Smoke hung thick in the cabin, stinging the cowboy's eyes and throat. The two men who had burst through the door lay sprawled across the floorboards, one moaning weakly, the other still. The fire hissed low, almost smothered by the rush of cold air from the broken door. The cowboy reloaded quickly, hands moving out of habit more than thought. His ears rang with the echoes of the shots, yet through the haze he could still hear the shouts outside, the clatter of boots, the bark of the leader's voice urging his men forward. The Apache woman stood steady by the doorway, her blade streaked, but her grip unbroken. Her chest rose and fell, but her eyes were calm, as though she had always known the storm would come to her door one day. She gave the cowboy one sharp look, a wordless signal, and then turned back toward the window where the snow swirled around shadows. Moving closer, another arrow hissed through the morning light, striking a man near the horses. He crumpled, his scream fading into the wind. The second Apache moved swiftly from the tree line, loosing another shot before vanishing again like a ghost of the land. The outlaw band had lost their edge of certainty now. Their voices rose with anger and panic. No longer confident, no longer sure that they would walk away whole. The leader roared over them all, his fury spilling into the snow. "Hold the line! Burn it if you must!" His revolver flashed, a bullet cracking through the window frame, splinters scattering across the woman's face. She didn't flinch. The cowboy returned fire, forcing the leader to duck behind a toppled barrel. The fight had spread across the village now, echoing off the silent homes, filling the frozen morning with smoke and steel. The cowboy felt his chest tighten. He could not let this drag on. The longer it lasted, the more the land itself would be scarred, and the woman who had shown him shelter would pay the price for his sins. He looked at her once more, the firelight catching her strong features, and he knew he had to end it. Not just for himself, but for her people, and for the proof he had carried across so many miles. He took a breath, steadying himself. "It's him I want," he said quietly, his voice rough. "The others are just shadows following his fire. Take him out, and the rest will scatter." The woman studied him for a heartbeat, then gave a small nod. She understood. The second Apache appeared again at the edge of the trees, his bow drawn, waiting for the signal. The cowboy holstered his revolver, adjusted the brim of his weathered hat, and stepped forward into the cold. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he left the broken cabin door behind. The wind tore at his coat, carrying the smell of powder and smoke. The leader's eyes snapped to him from behind his cover, and a cruel grin spread across his face. "There you are. I knew you'd crawl out sooner or later." The cowboy said nothing. His hand rested loose near his holster, his body poised like a coiled spring. The world seemed to shrink, every sound dimming until all that remained was the steady whistle of wind and the faint creak of leather. The leader stepped out, revolver drawn, his boots crunching with each measured step. "You should have stayed." "With us?" the man snarled. "We could have had it all. Now you're just another corpse waiting for snow to cover you." The cowboy's eyes narrowed. Better to die standing than live crawling. The leader's grin faded. For a long, breathless moment, neither moved. Then his hand twitched, and steel cleared leather. The gunfire cracked sharp as thunder. The cowboy's shot struck true, his revolver kicking once before smoke drifted from the barrel. The leader staggered, his face twisted in shock, and fell hard into the snow. His revolver slipped from his grasp, vanishing into the frost. Silence followed, heavy and final. The outlaws froze. Some dropped their weapons, fear written plain across their faces. Others turned and fled into the trees, their courage spent, their leader gone. The horses stamped wildly, their reins pulling against posts as though they too longed to escape the madness. The second Apache stepped from the trees, bow lowered but eyes still sharp, watching for the last flicker of danger. The cowboy stood over the fallen man, breath clouding in the air, his body trembling from the weight of it all. He had carried this moment across endless miles, through storms and shadows, and now it was done. The satchel lay scattered in the snow, papers torn and dirtied, but not lost. The proof remained, though scarred, much like himself. The Apache woman walked slowly toward him, her blade still in hand, though her steps were calm now. She looked down at the leader's body, then at the cowboy, her eyes unreadable. "It is finished," she said simply. The cowboy shook his head. "No, not finished. There are still families out there who lost everything to men like him. These papers, they mean something. They could set things right." She studied him in silence for a long time. Finally, she sheathed her blade. "Then make sure they do not rot in the snow. Do not let their names be forgotten." Her words struck deep, carving through the weariness in his chest. He bent down, gathering the scattered papers, tucking them carefully back into the satchel. Each page bore weight heavier than lead, stories written in ink and sealed with blood. He tied the satchel tight once more, lifting it as though it were an oath. The outlaws who remained threw one last glance before vanishing into the distance, leaving behind their wounded and their dead. The village grew quiet again, the only sounds the creak of trees in the wind and the low crackle of the cabin fire still burning faintly. The snow began to fall softer now, covering footprints, dimming the sharp edges of battle. The cowboy turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the warmth seemed almost unreal after the storm outside. The woman placed fresh wood on the fire, her movements steady, deliberate. The second Apache joined her, his bow set aside, though his eyes still watched the world with the alertness of one who had seen too much. The cowboy sank into the chair, his body aching, his soul heavier than before. Yet in the midst of smoke and silence, he felt something stir, a faint trace of hope, fragile but alive. He thought of the roads ahead, of towns and judges and men who still believed in law, however thin. He thought of the families whose land had been stolen, whose names lay inked across the papers in his satchel. He thought of the shelter given without hesitation, the fire that had warmed him, the woman whose eyes never wavered even when death stood at her door. "Why did you help?" "And me?" he asked at last, his voice low. The woman did not look up from the fire. "Because the storm does not ask who you are when it comes. It only asks if you will stand or if you will fall." Her words lingered in the air, carrying the weight of both truth and mercy. The cowboy nodded slowly, feeling them settle deep in his chest. He rose again, the satchel slung across his shoulder, his revolver at his side. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and endless, covering the scars of battle but never erasing them. He knew the trail ahead would be long filled with more shadows, more storms. Yet he also knew he would carry this night with him always, the shelter, the fire, the reckoning dot as he mounted his weary horse. The woman stood at the doorway, her blanket drawn around her shoulders, her face lit by the glow of the hearth. The second Apache stood beside her, silent as stone, his bow resting in his hand. They did not speak, and no farewell was needed. Some things were carried in silence, written in the snow and remembered by the land. The cowboy tipped his hat once, a gesture heavy with gratitude, and turned his horse toward the horizon. The wind cut sharp, but the storm had passed, leaving behind only the endless plains stretching wide and waiting. With the satchel secured, with the weight of choice upon him, he rode on into the dawn. The land was still, the sky pale, and though the road ahead promised no peace, the cowboy knew he had found something worth more than gold or vengeance. He had found a reason to keep riding, and so the trail carried him forward, each hoofbeat fading into the distance, leaving behind the village, the fire, and the memory of a night when strangers stood against the storm together. The snow fell softer, and the land, though scarred, breathed again.